The decision to wait until morning was recorded without emphasis in 3 separate journals. On the afternoon of March 14, 1891, 7 members of the Northern Peninsula Survey Commission stood at the edge of what their maps called Timber Bay, approximately 18 miles northwest of the small logging settlement of Ashwood, Michigan. They had been mapping watershed boundaries for the state's forestry initiative since late February, working through a winter that had proven milder than usual. Their camp, 3 canvas tents, a supply wagon, and a cook station, sat in a clearing that faced the frozen expanse of the bay, which connected, through a series of narrow channels, to Lake Superior. The group consisted of Albert Voss, the lead surveyor, age 43, his assistant, Martin Holcomb, 26, 2 chainmen, Peter Gunderson and Isaac Trent, a cook named Thomas Farley, and 2 recent additions to the expedition, Dr. Jonathan Reeves, a geologist from the University of Michigan, and his wife, Catherine Reeves, who had accompanied him north to sketch botanical specimens before the spring thaw. The Reeveses had joined the party only 9 days earlier, and their presence had subtly altered the social rhythm of the camp in ways the men found pleasant. Catherine Reeves was 31, practical, and kept detailed notes. The ice across Timber Bay had been solid for months. The men had crossed it twice already that week to retrieve equipment left at a cache site on the far shore. The bay was roughly 2 miles across at its widest point, narrowing to perhaps half that where the survey team had made their crossings. They had measured the ice thickness on March 10th and found it to be 14 inches in the center, more than adequate by Voss's judgment for men on foot. On the afternoon in question, the temperature had risen into the mid-40s. It was the 5th consecutive day above freezing. The sky was overcast but calm. There was no wind. Martin Holcomb, in his journal, noted that the air felt like April, though the calendar said otherwise. The question arose around 3 o'clock. Should they cross now to retrieve the theodolite and remaining stakes from the cache, or wait until morning? The equipment was not urgently needed. The next phase of their survey work would not begin until they moved camp, which was not planned until the 17th, 3 days away. Albert Voss said he preferred to go in the morning. The light was already beginning to fade, he reasoned, and there was no hurry. Dr. Reeves agreed. Thomas Farley was preparing an early supper. Peter Gunderson expressed no opinion. Isaac Trent, according to later testimony, suggested they go immediately, but did not insist. Catherine Reeves wrote in her field notebook that evening, "The men have decided to retrieve the instruments tomorrow. The ice remains quite solid. Albert says the crossing takes less than 30 minutes. What none of them recorded, because none of them fully registered it, was a sound that had started that morning. It was faint, intermittent, and easily mistaken for wind in the trees or the settling of snow on the hillside behind them. It was the sound of water moving beneath the ice." A notation appears in the logbook kept by the Ashwood District Ranger, filed 6 weeks later during the inquest. It reads, "March 14, 1891. Survey party made camp at Timber Bay. Weather mild. No concerns reported. Party could have withdrawn to Ashwood via overland route on evening of 14th with full light remaining. Route required 4 hours. Decision was made to remain." The rhythm of the camp that evening was ordinary in every detail that survives in the written record. Thomas Farley served a stew of salt pork, dried beans, and the last of the winter potatoes at 4:30. The men ate in the large tent, which had been erected with a center pole and a small sheet iron stove that Farley kept stoked throughout the meal. Catherine Reeves sat on a folding stool near the tent's entrance and sketched the far shore of the bay while there was still light. Her husband sat beside her and read aloud from a geological survey report published the previous year. The conversation, as reconstructed from the journals, touched on the quality of the timber in the region, the likelihood of rail expansion, and whether the state would designate the area for preservation or auction it for lumber contracts. Albert Voss had spent 17 years working for the State Land Office. He had conducted surveys in winter conditions many times. In his experience, ice on an inland bay like Timber Bay, protected from the fetch of the open lake, remained stable well into April in most years. He said as much over supper, and no one disagreed. Peter Gunderson, who had grown up near Marquette, mentioned that his father had once driven a team of horses across a bay, not unlike this one on Easter Sunday. The date had been April 16th. There was no reason to think they were in danger. The ice had been crossed safely just 2 days before. No cracks had been visible. The temperature, though above freezing during the day, had dropped below 30 degrees each of the previous 4 nights, which Voss believed was sufficient to prevent serious deterioration. The bay was not deep. Martin Holcomb estimated it at 20 to 30 feet in the center, but it was wide enough that a crossing required care and attention. They had marked their route with stakes on the 10th, and the stakes were still visible from camp. What they did not know, because no one in the party had the training to recognize it, was that the recent weather had created a condition sometimes referred to in later Ice Rescue Service manuals as deceptive integrity. The surface of the ice remained solid and white. Beneath it, however, warmth from the sun and the movement of water flowing into the bay from 2 tributaries had begun to erode the ice from below. By the evening of the 14th, the ice was structurally compromised in a diagonal band that ran from the southwest corner of the bay toward the center. This band was not visible. The ice above it had not cracked or sagged. It simply lacked the internal cohesion necessary to bear weight. The evening passed without incident. Martin Holcomb wrote a letter to his sister in Grand Rapids. Dr. Reeves made notes on sediment samples he had collected from a creek bed earlier in the week. Catherine Reeves mended a tear in her husband's coat. Isaac Trent played a harmonica quietly outside the tent until the cold drove him back inside. By 9 o'clock, most of the party had retired. The temperature that night dropped to 28 degrees. In his journal entry for March 15th, Albert Voss wrote, "Clear morning, ice firm, plan to cross after breakfast and return by noon." Catherine Reeves wrote, "We will retrieve the instruments today. Jonathan is eager to move camp northward. I have begun to look forward to returning to Ann Arbor, though the landscape here has a stark beauty I will miss. There is no record of anyone expressing doubt." The crossing began at 10 minutes past 8 on the morning of March 15th. Albert Voss led. He carried a canvas sack containing a coil of rope and a hatchet, standard equipment for ice crossings. Martin Holcomb followed, carrying a second sack. Behind him walked Dr. Reeves, then Peter Gunderson, then Isaac Trent. Thomas Farley remained at camp to break down one of the smaller tents. Catherine Reeves stayed behind as well. She had intended to accompany the group, but Voss had suggested, politely, without force, that 5 men were sufficient for the task and that the weight of a 6th person was an unnecessary variable. She had agreed without protest. The morning was cold and bright. There was no wind. The ice, seen from the shore, appeared unchanged from the previous days. The men walked in single file, spaced approximately 10 feet apart, following the line of stakes they had placed earlier in the week. They moved at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor lingering. Martin Holcomb later testified that the ice beneath his boots felt solid as a country road. Catherine Reeves watched them from the camp. She noted the time in her journal, 8:10 a.m., and then returned to the tent to organize her botanical sketches. She did not watch the entire crossing. The group reached the far shore without incident. The cache site was located in a stand of birch trees approximately 100 yards from the water's edge. The theodolite, stakes and other equipment were where they had been left, wrapped in oilcloth and stacked beneath a tarp, weighted with stones. The men loaded the equipment into 2 packs and began the return journey at approximately 8:40. The surface of the ice still showed no visible cracks. The sun was higher now, and the light was sharp and clear. Albert Voss led again. He had taken perhaps 200 steps from the shore when he heard a sound he described later as resembling the crack of a rifle shot, but lower, duller. He stopped. The others stopped as well. For several seconds, no one moved. The sound did not repeat. Voss took another step. The ice held. He took another. Martin Holcomb, 20 feet behind him, called out, "Do you want us to spread wider?" Voss considered this. Spreading the group would distribute their weight more evenly, which was standard procedure when ice conditions were uncertain. But the ice had shown no sign of weakness. The sound, he reasoned, might have been caused by thermal contraction, a common phenomenon in cold weather. He called back, "Keep the interval, move steady." They continued. They had covered approximately half the distance to the near shore, roughly 3/4 of a mile, when Martin Holcomb felt the ice beneath him shift. It was not a dramatic movement. He later described it as a sensation like standing on a floor that had warped slightly underfoot. He stopped walking and said quietly, "Albert." Voss turned. He saw nothing wrong. The ice around Holcomb appeared solid. Holcomb said, "I felt something give." Voss walked back toward him. As he did, Peter Gunderson, who was third in line, said, "I felt it too." The group stood motionless for perhaps 30 seconds. The ice made no further sound. There were no visible cracks. The stakes marking their route were still in place. The camp was visible on the near shore less than a mile away. The far shore behind them was equally close. Albert Voss looked at both shores and then at the ice around them. He made a decision. "We turn back," he said. It was the correct decision. It was also too late. As the men began to reverse their positions, carefully, without haste, the ice beneath Isaac Trent, who was at the rear of the line, sagged. It did not crack. It did not break through. It simply sank, smoothly and almost silently by several inches, as though the surface had become pliable. Trent stepped backward instinctively. The ice behind him sagged as well. "Move toward me," Voss said. His voice was calm. The men began to walk forward, toward Voss and toward the near shore. They had taken perhaps a dozen steps when the ice in the center of the group, directly beneath Martin Holcomb, gave way. There was no warning. The surface collapsed inward, opening a hole approximately 4 feet across. Holcomb dropped through instantly. He did not shout. The water took him before he could draw breath. The edges of the hole began to crumble. Peter Gunderson, 2 steps behind Holcomb, fell through a moment later. Dr. Reeves threw himself flat on the ice and tried to crawl backward. The ice beneath him fractured in a spiderweb pattern. He went under. Albert Voss and Isaac Trent, who were 15 and 20 feet from the hole respectively, lay prone on the ice and remained motionless. The ice around them creaked, but held. Voss called out to the men in the water, but there was no response. The water in Timber Bay, even in mid-March, was 34 degrees. The shock of immersion causes involuntary gasping, inhalation of water, and disorientation. Death from cold water immersion can occur in less than 3 minutes. The men in the water did not surface. Voss and Trent remained on the ice for several minutes, neither moving nor speaking. Then, slowly, Voss began to crawl toward the near shore. Trent followed. They reached solid ice near the shore at approximately 9:15. They stood up and walked the final 100 yards to camp. Catherine Reeves was standing at the edge of the clearing. She had heard nothing. The distance was too great, but she had been watching the ice intermittently since the men had started back. She saw 2 figures approaching instead of 5. She did not ask what had happened. She said later that she already knew. The recovery of the bodies did not begin until March 23rd, 8 days after the incident. The ice across Timber Bay remained partially intact until March 19th, when a sustained period of warm weather caused a rapid thaw. By the 21st, the bay was open water. On the 23rd, a recovery team organized by the District Ranger's office arrived at the site with boats and dragging equipment. The bodies of Martin Holcomb and Peter Gunderson were found on March 24th in approximately 22 feet of water, roughly 30 yards from the point where the ice had given way. Dr. Jonathan Reeves was found on March 26th, slightly farther from the site. All 3 men were found wearing their coats and boots. There was no evidence of struggle. The formal inquest was held in Ashwood on April 10th, 1891. Albert Voss and Isaac Trent provided written and oral testimony. Catherine Reeves provided a written statement but did not appear in person. Thomas Farley testified briefly regarding the camp's provisions and the condition of the ice as observed from shore. The district ranger, a man named Howard Lessing, testified regarding the weather conditions in the region during the relevant period. The inquest concluded that the deaths were accidental and that no individual bore criminal responsibility. The report noted, however, several points of concern. It stated that the party had remained at Timber Bay for 3 full days after temperatures had risen consistently above freezing. It stated that the decision to cross the ice on the morning of March 15th had been made without a formal assessment of ice conditions that morning. It stated that the party had possessed adequate time and resources to evacuate to Ashwood via the overland route on the evening of March 14th, and that this route would have removed all members from danger. The report concluded with a paragraph that was later cited in multiple training documents produced by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. The deceased were experienced men who exercised reasonable caution in the conduct of their work. The ice that failed beneath them had been crossed safely on multiple prior occasions and showed no visible signs of weakness until the moment of collapse. The Commission finds that the proximate cause of death was a misjudgment regarding the stability of the ice, but notes that this misjudgment was shared by all members of the party and was based on evidence that, to a layperson, would have appeared sound. The Commission further finds that the decision to delay evacuation from the site on March 14th was not negligent in a legal sense, but was nonetheless a decision that, had it been made differently, would have prevented all loss of life. Catherine Reeves returned to Ann Arbor in late April. She did not resume her botanical work. In a letter to a colleague dated June 3, 1891, she wrote, "I have gone over the days preceding Jonathan's death many times, searching for the moment when we should have known. I cannot find it. We believed we had time. That belief was shared by everyone, including Jonathan, who was not a careless man. I think what troubles me most is not that we were wrong, but that being wrong felt, at every moment, like being right." Albert Voss resigned from the State Land Office in August 1891. He moved to Wisconsin and took a position with a railroad surveying company. He never worked on ice again. In a letter to the head of the Northern Peninsula Survey Commission, written in October of that year, he stated, "I have been asked many times what I would have done differently. The answer is that I would have left the bay on the 14th. But I cannot say why I should have known to do so. The conditions on the 15th were not noticeably worse than they had been on the 12th or 13th. If I had crossed on the 14th and the ice had failed then, we would have died 1 day sooner. If we had waited until the 16th, we would have seen the ice begin to break up, and we would not have crossed at all. We happened to cross on the single day when the ice appeared safe, but was not. I do not believe there is a lesson in that, except that appearances are not always reliable, which is a lesson everyone already knows." Isaac Trent continued to work in survey crews for another 12 years. He did not speak publicly about the incident after the inquest. In a brief interview conducted in 1903 by a journalist researching logging history in Michigan, he said only, "We thought we had time to make a choice. We were wrong. That's all there is to it." The incident at Timber Bay was not widely reported outside of Michigan. A brief notice appeared in the Detroit Free Press on March 28, 1891, under the heading, "3 Drowned in Survey Accident." The Chicago Tribune ran a shorter item on April 2nd. No national publication covered the story. The inquest report was filed with the State Land Office and was later archived in the Michigan State Library, where it remained largely unexamined until it was referenced in a 1959 study of wilderness safety protocols. In the years since, the incident has occasionally been cited in technical literature on ice safety, though rarely in detail. It is mentioned briefly in a 1972 U.S. Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory Manual in a section on deceptive ice conditions. It appears in a footnote in a 1984 History of Land Surveying in the Great Lakes region. A historical marker was placed near the former site of the survey camp in 1991 on the 100th anniversary of the deaths, but the marker was removed in 2003 due to erosion of the access road. What remains is a small collection of documents, 3 journals, 2 letters, a filed inquest report, and a series of pencil sketches made by Catherine Reeves during the expedition. The sketches include one image of Timber Bay, drawn on the afternoon of March 14th. The ice is rendered as a smooth, unbroken plain. The far shore is visible in careful detail. In the lower right corner of the sketch, in Reeves's handwriting, is a note: "The bay. Very still." The historical significance of the Timber Bay incident is limited. 3 men died in circumstances that were neither unusual nor particularly dramatic. They did not die in a blizzard or a sudden storm. They died because they believed they had time to make a decision, and the time they believed they had did not exist. The ice that killed them had been safe the day before. It would have been visibly unsafe the day after. They crossed on the single morning when it appeared solid, but was not. There is no evidence that anyone in the party acted recklessly. There is no evidence that the warnings they missed were clear or obvious. The ice made a sound that morning, a low crack, but such sounds are common on frozen lakes and are not in themselves reliable indicators of imminent failure. The sensation of movement that Martin Holcomb and Peter Gunderson reported was subtle enough that neither man insisted on immediate retreat. Albert Voss, who led the party, made the decision to turn back as soon as he judged the conditions uncertain. The decision was correct. It was also insufficient. The question that haunted Catherine Reeves, "When should we have known?" is one that appears frequently in accounts of similar incidents. It is a question that assumes the existence of a clear moment when knowledge was available but not recognized. The archival record does not support this assumption. The men at Timber Bay had information. They had experience. They had caution. What they did not have was the specific, localized knowledge that the ice beneath them had deteriorated in a way that was not visible and that contradicted all their prior observations. They believed until the moment the ice gave way that they were safe. This belief was not irrational. It was not careless. It was simply wrong. The incident is sometimes invoked as a cautionary tale, though it is unclear what caution it is meant to teach. The men might have waited another day. They might have tested the ice more thoroughly. They might have crossed in a different location, or not at all. But each of these alternatives requires knowledge they did not possess at the time the decision was made. Hindsight reveals what should have been done. It does not reveal how they could have known to do it. What the record shows is this. On the evening of March 14, 1891, 7 people stood at the edge of a frozen bay and agreed that there was no urgency. The ice had been crossed before, the weather was stable, the equipment they intended to retrieve was not immediately needed. The decision to wait until morning felt prudent, even cautious, and in a narrow, technical sense, it was the decision that killed 3 of them. Not because they were careless, not because they ignored warnings, but because the margin between safety and disaster was thinner than they could have known, and because the moment when retreat was still possible passed quietly, unremarked, while they ate supper and wrote letters and looked forward to the work ahead. The last entry in Martin Holcomb's journal was written on the night of March 14th. It reads, "Clear skies. Albert says we will cross tomorrow. The ice is sound." He was 26 years old.